Yesterday we learned that the Mishnah talks about, well, before we talk about the Mishnah, actually, I should mention that there are different opinions as to the understanding of Abaye and Rava, what they did with their Tachanun. One of the opinions is the Ritva learns, like Isaac had explained yesterday, so Yasher Koyach Isaac, that what we do today is like Abaye and Rava did in the time of the Gemara, and they basically just leaned a little. And we also mentioned that there were different opinions, different understanding of why they did this leaning instead of doing the falling on their face. And there were basically three reasons. One had to do with the fact that there's a prohibition of, there are different limitations of lying on the ground on one's face. One has to do with if it's made out of stone. Another one is if a person is a scholar, and versus a scholar only if their prayers are going to definitely be answered should they do such a thing. So ultimately, because of these two reasons, either of the reasons, they're not dependent on each other. Each one individually are a reason why the custom became not to lean on one's face. Additionally, we mentioned the Zohar, and based on the Kabbalistic reason that it's a person does that they don't have the right concentration, the right intent, could have a negative effect on their life, and therefore we only do like a semi-tachanun, a semi-nefilas apayim, a semi falling on one's face. We don't do it exactly. We don't do it the way it used to be done in the time of the earlier days before the Gemara. Now, then the Gemara talked about bowing in Moedim, and I mentioned that I'm not familiar with people bowing the entire Moedim D'Rabbanan. Again, when the Chazan repeats the Shmoneh Esrei, do you bow during everyone bows when you say Moedim Anachnu Lach, but generally, from what I see and what I was always understood is the tradition is you bow in the beginning and that's it. But according to the commentary here that learns that we're talking about that we're talking about the prayer of the Moedim during the repetition of the Shmoneh Esrei. According to that understanding of this Gemara, it says that Rava bowed in the beginning of it and at the end of it. Not everyone agrees with this explanation, but if that's the explanation that we're referring to during the repetition, when the congregation says a certain paragraph called Moedim D'Rabbanan, do they bow in the beginning and in the end, or just in the beginning? So I mentioned that from what I always was taught, what I always understood was you just bow in the beginning. Our Gemara mentions that it could be a problem to bow at the end. It's Muguneh, it's a disgrace. But then the Gemara says that Rava did it. And Rava bowed both, the beginning and in the end. And he saw his rabbis did it, Rav Sheshas and the Rav Nachman, Rav Sheshas, both of them seem to bow both. And that's why Rava would bow both. And the Gemara talks about where it says it's a disgrace, that's referring to Noidel Lacha in the benching, or it's referring to in the Hallel, Hoidul Hashem Ki Tov. Both of those are not appropriate to bow. They're reciting thanks to Hashem. But here, the actual Moedim is connected to bowing to Hashem, and therefore it's appropriate to bow. And the only question is, should you bow in the beginning and at the end? And then we brought down that it's sort of like a intermediate. I don't know if I mentioned this term, but I saw brought down in one of the commentaries. They say that bowing for the entire Moedim is like it's like a going in the middle path, because you're not making a new bow, which could make it look like you're showing off, that you're bowing more than commanded. So if you stay bowed the entire Moedim, then you're fulfilling the other opinion without it showing off, because you're not doing an extra bow at the end. You're still full. You're still in the same bow. It's brought in the Ramah that seems like the appropriate thing to do. So to me, it's surprising, because I don't recall seeing people bow the entire Moedim. Even this morning, I tried to look at the rabbi of the shul that I daven in, and he definitely did not stay bowed the entire Moedim. He was shuckling, so it's a little hard to know if he was in a more bowed state when he was shuckling, but he definitely was not like fully bow during the Moedim. So I don't know if the tradition is, but I'm still looking into that. But from our Gemara and from the Shulchan Aruch, it seems like it is appropriate to do like a semi bow during the Moedim for the entire Moedim, the entire rabbinic Moedim. Again, that's one way of learning this Gemara. The other way of learning the Gemara is that we're talking about the Moedim of your private Shmona Esrei, not during the repetition of the Chazan, but we're talking about the Moedim of your Shmona Esrei. Do you bow in the beginning and in the end? And in the end would mean at Hatoiv Shimcha Ulachano Elohaidos. At the end would mean the blessing after that paragraph. There's a blessing in the next paragraph, and that's what we would be referring to. That Rava bowed. These are the 4 times that he bowed: the first 2 blessings of the Shemona Esrei and the last 2 blessings of the Shemona Esrei. And when it says in the Brisa that it's magun, it's a disgrace, that's talking about in the benching, in Hallel, or in the benching. So that's how that's the previous Gemara. Then we had the Mishnah. The Mishnah talked about making a mistake in the davening. And if a person makes a mistake in the davening, it's considered a bad sign. And the Gemara explained that meant in the first blessing of the davening. That somehow if you make a mistake in the first blessing of the davening, it's a bad sign for you. And if the shliach tzibur, if the leader makes a mistake, it's a bad sign for those that command, that asked him, for the community, the congregation. It's a bad sign for them. And I saw 2 explanations. One is it's a bad sign because obviously he's not having, it should be easy for him to have kavana in the concentration in the beginning of the Shemona Esrei. And if he's not having concentration in the beginning, that's a bad sign. In other words, we understand people have attention deficit limitations, and they drift off. But in the beginning, at least, they should be able to concentrate. So here, if a person makes a mistake in the first bracha, that's considered a bad sign for him. Now, the other explanation is it's that the fact that he's drifting, that Hashem is sort of causing him to make a mistake, means that Hashem doesn't want his prayer. And Hashem would show this in the beginning of the prayer, that I don't really care so much about this guy's prayer. So those would be the 2 explanations. Either the person's not concentrating, or Hashem is giving him like a sign. It is a sign that Hashem is not really excited over his prayer, the fact that he's making a mistake. And it specifically applies in the first blessing, because that's when you should have good concentration. And number 2, that's when Hashem would be showing someone that he really doesn't care so much for their prayer. And then we mentioned the story about Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa, the story in the Mishnah of Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa, that he would daven for sick people, and he was able to say, this one is going to live and this one isn't. And they asked him, how do you know this? And he said, well, very simple. If my prayer goes smoothly, then I know that it was accepted. If not, then I know that the prayer is not accepted, or that the sick person is not going to live. So that was the Mishnah. And then again, the Gemara started off saying, where is this applicable? And it says, as I mentioned, it says in the first blessing of the Shemona Esrei, the blessing called Avos. That's the first blessing of the Shemona Esrei, where we mention the patriarchs, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, and then we conclude blessing the shield of Avraham, Magen Avraham, and that is what we're referring to. If a person makes a mistake, or if the Chazan makes a mistake, in that specifically, in that bracha, is where it really is a bad sign. And then the Gemara brought an alternative understanding of that statement, that it applies in the first blessing of Shemona Esrei. What applies in the first blessing? A different thing. That a person needs to have kavana, needs to have concentration in the first blessing of Shemona Esrei. That's where it's very important to have kavana, have concentration or intent. And if a person doesn't, that would be a major problem. Even if, in other words, really a person should have intent in the whole Shemona Esrei. If a person can't, at least in the first blessing of Shemona Esrei. And that would be the understanding, the alternative understanding of this statement, that where do we say that the first blessing is unique, we say it with regard to having having concentration and understanding the the words of what you're saying. That's in the first blessing of Shemoneh Esrei. So again, let me just clarify this. There are two ways of understanding how the first blessing of Shemoneh Esrei is unique. One way is that if a person makes a mistake in the first blessing of the Shemoneh Esrei, that would be a bad sign, only if he makes a mistake in the first blessing. That would be how the first blessing is unique, that it would show if it's a bad sign. Another way of the first blessing being unique is where is it important to really concentrate. Now, of course, it's important the whole Shemoneh Esrei to concentrate, but if a person is not able to, at least he has to concentrate in the first blessing of the Shemoneh Esrei, called the blessing of Avos. So that would be another way of how the first blessing of the Shemoneh Esrei is unique. Now, I mentioned once before that there is a contradiction in the Rambam. The Rambam at one place implies that a person has to concentrate the entire Shemoneh Esrei, and if he doesn't, his prayer is really not worth anything if he doesn't concentrate. In another place in the Rambam, in the same laws of prayer, different chapter, he writes that if a person needs to concentrate, if he doesn't, it's not good, only in the first bracha. But in the other brachas, if you didn't concentrate, it's okay. So this is a contradiction, because one place the Rambam says the whole Shemoneh Esrei, you need to concentrate. If you don't, it's not valid. Other place, he basically concludes that only the first blessing is what's important. So there's a famous insight from Rabbi Chaim Soloveitchik, the Reb Chaim Halevi, a famous commentary on the Rambam, the Rosh Yeshiva of Volozhin, the head of the yeshiva of Volozhin, whose name was Reb Chaim. He has a whole book on explaining contradictory Rambams that seem to contradict themselves, and statements from the Rambam, or questions from the Gemara to the Rambam. In any event, the Reb Chaim answers this contradiction by saying that there's a difference if a person knows. There's a concentration where a person knows who they're standing in front of, meaning they're standing before Hashem. That's one type of concentration. Another type of concentration is understanding the words you're saying. These are two separate laws. One law applies to the entire Shemoneh Esrei. You have to know before whom you are standing. That law applies to the entire Shemoneh Esrei. The other law that you need to concentrate on the first blessing is understanding the words. Understanding the words, you should understand the first blessing. That's important to understand what you're saying. Yes, Robert.
There is in Art Scroll, there is a reference to Chaim Soloveitchik, exactly what you say.
Oh, okay, good. It's very the typical discussion on this Gemara.
Right.
So that the Art Scroll picked it up. I did once mention this Reb Chaim maybe a month ago. It was applicable to a Gemara that we learned, but I'm just mentioning it now because it fits with this Gemara. The Gemara mentions here that you have to concentrate on the first blessing. What does that mean? Concentrate on the first blessing. So according to this Reb Chaim's explanation, it means, the way he's explaining the Rambam, it means you have to understand the words of the first Shemoneh Esrei, of the first blessing of Shemoneh Esrei. Yes, Susan.
Okay, yesterday I looked up the Hebrew word for necromancy, and what came up was the word love. That the way in Hebrew, the way the word love is spelled is similar to a bad omen. Is that so?
I'm not so familiar with that. I don't know.
Okay,
maybe someone who knows Hebrew better. But ohev is generally love, and what you're saying would be, maybe oiv without the head. It's spelled differently. It's spelled. Yes. It sounds a little similar, but it's spelled differently. Yeah.
See, that's where I'm getting very confused. When someone is when you're describing certain words, what they mean, it's very confusing.
Yeah, well, Susan, everything takes time. You can't, don't expect to pick it up on one foot. Everything takes
Rabbi?
time. Yes, Edith.
Rabbi, so saying that you have to understand, so does that mean it would be better to say it in English than in Hebrew if you don't really understand the full Hebrew?
So I think what's important is the understanding of the blessing, understanding it doesn't necessarily mean each letter, each word. It means you're understanding what the blessing is about. You're blessing the shield that Hashem, blessed is Hashem, the shield of Abraham, and the God of the patriarchs. When you're saying, so if you just have a general understanding of the words of the first blessing, if I'm not mistaken, that should be that's acceptable. So you could daven in English, but I mean it's not the common thing. Most people, they try to just do it right. In other words, do the Hebrew and slowly pick up the each word, the language, and the translation. But until then, at least you have the general understanding of the paragraph. Yes, Susan.
Rabbi, so is it okay if I read sometimes the Hebrew is translated phonetically? Is that considered
That's Hebrew?
But is it okay blessing to do that in front of Hashem?
But for the first blessing of Shemona Esrei, it's advisable for you to just read the English and get an understanding of what that blessing is, and then say it in the Hebrew.
Okay, thank you.
It's called transliterated.
Yeah.
Okay, so then we mentioned, as we concluded yesterday's class, we mentioned that the rabbis were talking about the time when God is going to give special rewards that all the prophets prophesied about. These rewards, the Gemara says, that's not the real, that's not the greatest reward. There's really even much greater. That's for someone who does the right thing. He helps out the scholars, and he marries his daughter to a scholar. He does business with scholars, he lets scholars benefit from his possessions. That they will get those rewards. But the scholar themselves, they're going to get a much greater reward that the eye doesn't see. Only Hashem sees it, and he will do it to those that he will give it to those that await him. And that was the verse, Ayin Lairasa Elikim Zulascha. That an eye hasn't seen it, only Hashem. Only Hashem knows the reward. And he will do this for those that await him. And that refers to the scholars that they, for themselves, they will actually get this much greater reward that you can't be expressed in words. Now, who are those that await him? It's referring, the Gemara is here is explaining that those that await him means the scholars. And the Maharsha explains over here that there's a reward that you can enjoy intellectually, and then there's reward that's beyond intellect. You won't be able to grasp it. The scholars are going to get that spiritual reward that they don't grasp, but they will enjoy. But these rewards are like they're able to be grasped. You can actually grasp them, and that's what the Nevi'im, the prophets, prophesied about. You're able to understand it, so that's why it's mentioned. That's why it's able to say it, because it's something that could be grasped. Those are all the writings in the books of Isaiah and the prophecies of the time of Mashiach. That's going to be, the wolf will lie with the lamb. All these, all the delicacies will be found all over the place. And this is for those that do business with a scholar, help out a scholar, marry their daughter to a scholar. But the scholars themselves are going to have even a greater reward. Now we're going to continue with the Gemara that we're on. We're on the third the third wide line, which is, I would say, maybe a little more than halfway down the page, maybe about 25 lines up from the bottom. Reb Chia bar Abba says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Kol Anavim Kulan, all the prophets that prophesied wonderful, great things for the Loinus Nabu Eloli Yemais HaMashiach. They did not prophesy only for the days of Mashiach. And there is a later stage of Olam Haba, for the time of Olam Haba, that is something else. Olam Haba ayin lo rasa elikim zulascha. An eye hasn't seen, only Hashem sees, and that's for Olam Haba. That's going to be the greatest reward that we can't even discuss. That's for Olam Haba. Now, what does exactly that mean? That means that there's two stages in the when Mashiach comes. There's the time when Mashiach comes, and then there's afterwards a time of Techias HaMesim. So one way of understanding this is that when the resurrection of the dead happens, that's going to be a whole different ball game. That's going to be a tremendous revelation. So in other words, the first statement said, Reb Chia bar Abba explained in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that the scholars are going to be able to get this great reward, not even similar to what the prophecies, what the prophets prophesied. And now we mentioned the same rabbi, Reb Chia bar Abba, the name of Rabbi Yochanan, he mentions that even those prophecies, they're talking about Yemais HaMashiach. During the Chias HaMesim, which we're calling Olam Haba, the world to come, that's going to be, that's really going to be a great revelation. Now, this argues with Shmuel that the prophecies of the prophets will happen when Mashiach comes. Again, there's two stages. You have to understand. First, Mashiach is going to come, and then we're going to have the resurrection of the dead. And the question is, what happens during this first stage of Mashiach coming? Is the world going to change or not? So according to Reb Chia bar Abba, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, there will be a change in the world. The world will change. What will change? Well, the fact is that the prophecies that the prophets prophesied about will happen, will take place. So that means that there will be great revelation in the time of Mashiach, but that even that revelation will be nothing compared to when the Tchias HaMesim, the resurrection of the dead, happens. When that happens, that's going to be a much greater revelation. Now, this argues with Shmuel, the famous rabbi in the Talmud called Shmuel. He had a state. He says that when Mashiach comes, there's not going to be much difference than the way life was before Mashiach comes. The only difference that there will be is that we won't have the subjugation of the nations that subjugate us. We won't have that. We won't have all the suffering that we have in these countries that cause suffering to the Jewish people. We won't have that. So, Upliga de Shmuel, the Gemara says this statement of Reb Chia bar Abba argues on Shmuel. The Amar Shmuel, because Shmuel says, "Ein bein ha'olam hazeh." There's no difference between the world we live in now, this world, liyamais haMashiach, to the days of Mashiach, ela shibud malchiyos belvad, only the subjugation of the nations, of the kingdoms alone. That's the only difference, because people will still be poor, people will still be rich, people will still be suffering, people will still be sick. There'll be all different challenges, just like we have now. The only difference when Mashiach comes is the Shibud Malchios. We won't have any saris from the evil nations that they cause problems to the Jewish people. That we won't have. When will all the other problems go away? When we have Tchias HaMesim, when the resurrection of the dead takes place. But in the first stage, that is that is not that there isn't going to be much difference. Yes, Robert.
So I read this. It says again the Jewish independence from the dominion of foreign kingdoms. So part of what I'm struggling with, wasn't there, or is there something when the coming of the Mashiach, there will be an ingathering of the Jews in Israel? So so then we won't be living under other kingdoms because we will be whole now that Mashiach comes and we're in Israel. That's
a nice explanation that you're trying to say. In other words, why?
I'm trying.
How?
Yeah,
very nice. So in other words, Robert is explaining that how are we going to have a time that we're not going to be subjugated by the nations when Mashiach comes? If everything else is staying the same, what really is changing when Mashiach comes that's going to cause the nations not to subjugate us? And on that, Robert explains that because Mashiach is going to have an ingathering of the exiles, in this way, the nations won't have any jurisdiction over any Jews because they will be gathered. We will be gathered in Eretz Yisrael. We will be able to travel to Israel, and we will have the ingathering of all the exiles. That would seem to be a very nice explanation. Thank you, Robert. Sounds good. Yes, Susan.
I was always under the impression that when Mashiach comes, that everything will be utopia on earth.
So this Gemara is sharing with you two opinions. There is one view, Shmuel's view, and the other view is Rabbi Yochanan's, Reb Chia bar Abba in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. And one view is that it will be utopia, and that's Reb Chia bar Abba in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, and that's all the prophecies. And the other view is the Shmuel's view. Now, I will mention that there is a big problem here because the Rambam brings both. He mentions Shmuel's thing, and he mentions Rabbi Yochanan's, the Reb Chia bar Abba in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. So in Code of Law, he brings both. So the commentaries struggle to try to figure out how did the Rambam learn? The argument clearly says there's an argument. And how does the Rambam understand that they both can go together? So one of the explanations is that there's two stages in the days of Mashiach itself. There's really two stages. So according to that, Susan, what you're saying is not wrong. In a later stage of the days of Mashiach, before Tchias HaMesim, maybe before the resurrection of the dead,
okay.
Even then there will be a stage of the days of Mashiach that we will have the utopian state. It's just not going to start right away. That's Shmuel. The other opinion is that it would start right away. Yes, Yehuda.
Yeah, I want to get back to Robert's explanation.
Yeah.
So I understand that all the Jews are going to be in Israel, but how is that going to prevent the Arabs from attacking us?
So what the explanation that Robert was giving, from my understanding, is that there's one element that's going to change, and that is that somehow the Jewish people will be able to all come together and gather together, and that's going to cause the nations not to want to. No one's going to have any jurisdiction over. In other words, it goes hand in hand with no one being able to have jurisdiction over.
Right. We won't be subjugated by other people any longer.
I guess they'll see from the fact that we all there and that we had, that we're able to, that we're on our own. In other words, at that point, I guess the nation, the people in charge, they're going to give it over to Mashiach, and Mashiach is going to control, and so no one else will have any, won't have the clowns that for the political clowns that think they know what they're doing.
Really?
We'll have Mashiach running the show. Yes, Ben.
Moshe.
I thought my understanding was that even the dead will come to life and get to Israel.
Yes, but that will be possibly at a later stage. In other words, the Rambam mentions we don't really know exactly every detail, so that's why I say possibly a later stage. Maybe we hope it will happen like seconds later, but we don't know exactly how much later it'll be, and however there is a concept that that people will die and then will come back, but it could be that death isn't literal, and that means that people will feel v'nafshi ka'ofra lakoltiya. People will feel like they are like dust, and that will be in fulfilling that obligation. So it's definitely things that are unclear, as the Rambam writes. But I should also mention that there is a concept that there will be a resurrection of the dead even before Mashiach comes. It says the righteous are not going to miss out on the revelations, and therefore they're going to merit to come to life and see the revelation of Mashiach. So they're going to actually come. There's a Gemara that says this, that Moshe and Aaron imahim, that Moshe and Aaron will be with them seeing the revelation. So what do you mean? Moshe and Aaron passed away already. But it said there is a concept that there will be a difference in stage of when the resurrection of the righteous happens versus the resurrection of everyone. And
the resurrection of the righteous is also done by people later having the same neshama.
Now that's a good question. Now you're getting a little complicated. What happens when two people have a spark from one neshama? How does that work? I would think that each one is going to have their resurrection. It's not going to be, my understanding is each one will be resurrected separately. So depends on how they acted. Yes, Moshe.
I also understand that the sun, there's going to be.
Moshe, you got to turn off. There's a lot of echo. You got to. You have two.
It's my understanding that there's going to be, the sun is going to get very hot. The core of the sun is going to change, and there's going to be, plant life is going to be much more intense than it is right now. There's going to be larger plants, almost like it was during the eras when, Mesozoic era, Cenozoic era, and those eras where the plant life was getting very, very large. That's one thing I want to say. The other thing is that there's going to be there'll be Gilgulim. They're going 7 Gilgulim will of our previous lives we're supposed to witness that as well. Other lives that we lived.
What's
wow.
Gilgulim?
Wow. Those are Kabbalistic ideas, the Gilgulim. We don't know that much about these. We don't study about these things generally, but you're right. It does say that people do come in Gilgulim. It's correct. It's true. And I don't know all the details of how that's going to work, but thank you for bringing up those 2 points. Okay, let's continue. So we have here a argument between Shmuel and Reb Chia bar Abba in the name of Reb Yochanan about how are things going to be in the beginning stage of the days of Mashiach. And what is the proof? Shmuel has a proof. He says, Ki shenemar, as it says in the verse, Ki lo yechtal evyon mikarav haaretz. There will not be we will not lack a evyon, a poor person in the midst of the earth. That means that even in the days of Mashiach, there will be a time when there will be still poor people. Now, the next Gemara continues, and it says that Reb Chia bar Abba says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Kol hanaviyim kulon, all the prophets, loinis nabu elul bali tshuva, they only prophesied for people who sinned and repented. Aval tzadikim gemurin, but righteous people, completely righteous people that never sinned, ayin leirasa elikim zulasko. No eye has seen except Hashem what they are going to receive. Because they are so great, the tzaddikim that never sinned, therefore they will merit tremendous reward. And so according to this Gemara, it sounds like, who's better, a tzaddik or a Baal Tshuva? This sounds like a tzaddik is better than a Baal Tshuva. And I see 2 people are very bothered with this. Is that right? Is that what you're bothered with, Ben? Yehuda, are you bothered with this?
Well, I'm bothered with how could anyone not sin? Even Moshe Rabbeinu, who's the greatest the most righteous person, he sinned. So you're saying that somebody is greater than Moshe?
So it does say that Moshe was the greatest in prophecy, but there were 4 people that never sinned. One of them was Yishai, one of them was Binyamin, Kislev, one of them was David's son Kislev, and the 4th one slips my mind, but I'm sure Google knows. But anyway, there were people who never sinned. Yeah, it does say that there were 4 that never sinned. I'm sure if I look it up here, let's see. It says even their death was only because of Amram, I think. Amram, I think, is the 4th one. Let's see over here. Anyway, the only other thought that comes to mind is, do we mean a tzaddik that this might be an answer? I'm not sure, but it might be an answer that. Oh, one second. So the 4 people are Binyamin, Amram, Yishai, and Kislev. Yeah, Binyamin, Amram, Yishai, and Kislev. So those are the 4 people. The other answer that I'm thinking of is that, are we talking about, what type of Baal Tshuva are we talking about? If a person sinned so completely that his previous sins are now mitzvahs, are we possibly talking about that he could be called a tzaddik now because he's gotten rid of his evil inclination? Could he fall into the category of tzaddik if he removed his evil inclination, and though he doesn't have any potential to sin, but he did sin in the past? And the Baal Tshuva that we're talking about is someone who still has evil inside him, but he doesn't have any sins. He's done tshuva, but he didn't remove his evil from inside him completely. He still has desires to do bad. So if you translate it that way, then the tzaddik, there are many people who could fall into the category of tzaddik, even if they've sinned, but they've reached a level where they've removed any desire to do bad from within them, either through fasting or through their righteous acts and begging Hashem to remove their evil. And if they did it that way, then maybe they could be considered this tzaddik that Rav Chia bar Abba in the name of Rabbi Yochanan is talking about, that type of tzaddik who doesn't have any evil inside him, he will merit this revelation that only Hashem knows about. And the prophecies that the prophets talked about, that's for the regular Baal Tshuva, person who does tshuva. But he didn't remove the evil from the desire of evil from within him. He just doesn't do any bad actions. But he still has a desire for something that's inappropriate, for things that are inappropriate, like every person does. Yes,
Rabbi.
Anyway, that's a thought that maybe include more people. Yes,
I was on mute before, I couldn't talk. Or you didn't hear me. My take on that sentence is that humans are incapable of seeing a real tzaddik, a complete tzaddik. God is the only one that is.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Rabbi.
You mean that we don't know who's a tzaddik, or we won't see them? What do you mean?
We are incapable of seeing them, you know. We
seeing physically? I mean, David.
No. To really identify who a real tzaddik is. We can't see it. God knows exactly who the real tzaddik is.
Right, of course. There's no question about that. Yeah, for sure. Okay, yes, Moshe.
What about Lamed Vavnik? Is that what they're called? Those who are
it would seem like they would be considered from the tzaddikim. Now, there are different levels of tzaddikim, and the Lamed Vav tzaddikim would be right. The only problem is that the question is, what does the Gemara mean that the tzaddik versus the Baal Tshuva? So they've reached a level of tzaddik, but when a person does tshuva, they also reach a level of tzaddik. So that's the sort of like the question on the Gemara, because when a person does tshuva, isn't he a tzaddik afterwards? So how do you differentiate between a tzaddik and a Baal Tshuva? In other words, the Lamed Vav tzaddikim, how do we differentiate? So the one simple way of differentiating would be that a very surface level learning would be that these never sinned and these sin, but they reach the level of tzaddik also, but they're not from the tzaddikim who never sin. But the other way of explaining it would be that there's tzaddikim who get rid of the evil that are within them, and it's either batel b'shishim, or it could be it's either nullified in 60 times as much. So even if they didn't nullify it completely, but they nullified it somewhat, or and that's called a tzaddik, or they nullified it in 100. It's diluted the evil inside them, the evil desire, diluted. Different ways of diluting things to make them. So that the Lamed Vav tzaddikim would be a good point that we call them tzaddikim, we don't call them Baalei Tshuva, Lamed Vav tzaddikim. But good point, Moshe. But in any event, so I think you could translate, we could understand the Gemara that way. Now the Gemara then says, but this is very surprising.
Rabbi, somebody is eating very noisily. I think.
Oh, let me mute everyone. I don't know why. I don't always hear these things. So the Gemara now has a big problem. It says, what do you mean a tzaddik is greater than a Baal Tshuva? We always know that a person who does tshuva is greater than a tzaddik, right? So it turns out it's an argument. So the Gemara says, Upliga de Rebavo. This argues with the statement of Rebavo. Rebavo says, Makim shebal tshuva imdim, place where Baal Tshuva stands. Tzaddikim gemura neina imdim. The complete tzaddik doesn't stand there. Shenemar, as it says, Shalom, Shalom, Larachik, Lakarov, peace to the far and to the near. And who do we say first? The one who's far. God gives a blessing to the one who's far, meaning because he became close, meaning the Baal Tshuva, we call him Rachik. And only afterwards is there peace to the Karov, to the person who never sinned in the first place. It's called the Tzaddik Gomer. So what comes out from here is that according to Rabbi Yochanan, a Tzaddik is greater than a Baal Tshuva. And according to Rabbi Avo, a Baal Tshuva is greater than a Tzaddik. Again, what we're talking about is someone who repents. Is that better? Is he on a higher level than a person who never sinned? Or is a person who repents on a lower level than a person who never sinned? Where do they stand? And the Gemara now has a little problem because what does Rabbi Yochanan do with that verse? That it says peace goes first to those that are far and then to those that are near. It sounds like a Baal Tshuva is greater than a tzaddik. And how did Rabbi Yochanan hold that a tzaddik is greater than a Baal Tshuva? What about the peace that it goes first to those that are far and then that it goes to the ones that are near? Rabbi Yochanan, what does Rabbi Yochanan do with that verse? Amar Allah, he'll tell you what does it mean? Shahir, my rachik. What does rachik mean? It means shahir rachik means baravera meikara. He was far away from a sin from the beginning, and he never came close to it. He's rachik means the tzaddik. That's rachik. In my karav, what does karav mean? Who's the karav? The person who's close. It means shaya karav lidvar avera v'nesrachik b'meno hashta. Someone who's close to sin, meaning he did sins and he left it. Now he removed himself from it, so he became a Baal Tshuva. So Rabbi Yochanan translates the verse differently. According to Rabbi Vahu, the translation of rachik and karav, a far person and a near person. According to Rabbi Vahu, the far person means someone who's far, means he's wandered away from Judaism. He's far. And then even though he did tshuva, he would call him far. He's someone who has wandered. And the person who's close is the person who never wandered away. And the according to Rabbi Yochanan, no. The person who's far is the person who is the tzaddik. He's far. He wandered away from sin, not wandered away from Judaism. He wandered away from sin. He's far from sin. The person who's far from sin, he gets peace. But Lakara, and also the person who's close to sin, but he did tshuva, he will also get peace. And my ayin lo'ira. So what does it mean that it says that a prophet can't see, or no person could see? What does it mean that the eye doesn't see? What is this referring to? So is a yayin hamashumer ba'anava. This is wine that has been guarded in its grapes. Misheshus yimei bereshis, from the 6 days of creation. Now, people who like wine, they know that aged wine is really good. Now, can you imagine aged wine that's been aged for 5,782 years? That's quite a wine. And it's aged by God himself, the chief winemaker, meaning the one who created winemakers, the one who created wine, the one who created our taste buds. And he has been guarded. This has been guarded from the time of creation. It'll be like the joy that a person would have from wine, that it'll be a joy that's to no end. And then the Gemara says, some say this means that it's the wine that's hidden. Wine means hidden secrets. Some say this refers to the Kabbalistic secrets that are going to be revealed. So that we're going to be able to understand all those secret ideas that were beyond our understanding, we weren't eligible to understand. We will be able to be given the secrets of all these of God. And then the Gemara says a different opinion. Shmuel bar Nachmani Amar Zeh Eden. This is what we call Eden. Shalei Sholto by Ayin Kol Birya, that no eye ever saw Eden. What do you mean no eye saw Eden? What about Adam? Shema Taimar Adam Arishan. Maybe you'll say, what about Adam? He lived in the Garden of Eden. Adam Arishan Heichon Haya, where was he? He was in Eden. He saw it. So how could you say no eye ever saw it? The Gemara says, no, it's not a problem. He lived in the Gan, Bagan. He was in the Gan, the garden. So the Gemara says, what? What do you mean? Maybe that's the same. B'Shema Taimar, Hu Gan, Hu Eden. Maybe that's the same thing. Talmud Laimar, there's a verse that clearly says they're different. The verse says, V'Nahar Yotze Eden, Lahashkes Esagan. There is a river that leaves from Eden to wash the Gan, to water the garden. So there's a place called Eden, and there's a place called Garden of Eden. And the garden is is further away from Eden, where the water streams into the garden from Eden. And so we see from there, Gan L'chod, Eden L'chod. Eden is, they're two separate things. Gan is a thing of its own, and Eden is a thing of its own. So the Garden of Eden is different than Eden itself. So so what's the best place? Is it the Garden of Eden or is it Eden? Which one is better? So from this Gemara, we see it's the garden, it's Eden that's the best. Eden is the best. The Garden of Eden is what Adam was able to see. But the Eden, no one ever saw. So Eden must be the highest, the greatest. Okay. Tana Rabbanan, the rabbis learned in a brisa. There's a story that Rabbi Gamliel's son fell sick. Shiger Shnei Talmidei Chachamim Eitzer Rabbi Chanina ben Doisa. He sent 2 scholars to Rabbi Chanina ben Doisa, Levakish Olav Rachmim, to pray for him. So even though Rabbi Gamliel was a great scholar and great holy man, but he sent the two scholars to go to Rabbi Chanina ben Doisa, tell him that my son is sick, and to pray for him. Kivan Sharai, so when he saw them, Rabbi Chanina ben Doisa saw them coming, he went up to the attic, Uvigesh Olav Rachmim. So he saw them coming, he knew that someone's sick. So he went and prayed for him. Maybe he knew, I guess he knew that Rabbi Gamliel's son was already sick. This way he knew who to pray for. So he knew that he was sick. So when he saw them coming, he understood that it's serious. This is an explanation of the Marsha. So he went up to the attic, and he prayed. When he came down from the attic, Amar Lahem, he told these emissaries, "Lechu, go, shecholatzatoi chama." The fever has gone away. The fever went away. Amar Loi, Amru Loi, the emissaries told to Rabbi Chanina, "Chinaviyato, are you a prophet?" Amar Lahen, Loi Navi Anochi, Loi Ben Navi Anochi. I'm not a prophet. I'm not the son of a prophet. Elakach Mekublani. This I have a tradition from my teachers. Im Shagura Tfilosi Befi. If the prayer is smooth, is
Smooth.
Is that the best word? There must be a better word, but I'll translate it that for no lack of a better term. If the prayer is smooth in my mouth, I know that it is accepted. If it's not smooth, if I stutter, if I make a mistake, if I know that the prayer is not accepted and it's torn up. Yashvu, they sat, the Kosvu, and they wrote down this story, the Chivnu Isa Shah, and they calculated what time it is exactly when Reb Chanina ben Doisa did his prayer. They wrote it down. The Shabo Eitzel Reb Gamliel, when they came and they told the story to Reb Gamliel, Amar Lehen, Reb Gamliel said, "Ha'avoda, I swear that I swear by the service in the temple, it wasn't missing one moment, and it wasn't more than one moment. This is the story, Ba'isa Shah, exactly at that time, is when his fever left. V'shoal lanu mayim lishtais, and he had asked us for water to drink. So that story shows the greatness of Rabbi Chanina ben Doisa, how, number one, they used to go to him to pray for them, and even the great rabbis, and how exact he was, and how it was so he was able to know if the person's was better, and at the exact moment. And then the Gemara says, "Shuv ma'isa Rabbi Chanina ben Doisa shahalach lil my Torah eitzel Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai." Rabbi Chanina ben Doisa, another story. He went to study Torah by Rabbi Yochanan. V'chol b'nai shel Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's son was sick. Amar Loi. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai told him. He says, "Chanina b'ni, Chanina my son." He's his student. He's telling him, "I need you to pray for me. Akesh olav rachamim, pray for my son V'yichya, that he should live." Hiniach Roishay ben Birkov, says he put his head between his knees, Ubigesh olav rachamim, and he requested mercy from Hashem. V'choya, and the son lived. Amar Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said, "Male hitiach ben Zakkai, as Roishay, if I myself, the son of Zakkai, would have thrown as Roishay ben Birkov, my head, if Ben Zakkai, if the son of Zakkai would have thrown his head between his knees, Kolayam Kulai, his whole day, in heaven they would not have looked at him to accepted his prayer. But for Rabbi Chanina, they accepted his prayer. I could have done this all day, it wouldn't have worked. My student, Chanina, he was able to do his prayer and it worked. So Amrullah Yishtai, so his wife tells him, you have to understand who we're dealing with. This is the famous Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, the greatest leader of the generation of during the Churban, he saw the destruction of the temple, and he was the greatest scholar of the day, and yet he's saying about his student that he went to his student to pray for him, pray for his son. And he said that if I would have prayed, it would have been worthless. I could have done a whole day. They wouldn't have accepted my prayer. So his wife says, "V'chi Chanina gadol mimcha, is Chanina your student greater than you?" Amar la. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said, "Lav, no, he's not greater than me in greatness." Alahu daima kabed lefnei hamelech. But in here, the Gemara says an interesting line. He's similar to a servant before the king. V'ani daima kasar lefnei hamelech. I'm like a minister before the king. And the way it works, on a very simple level of understanding this, is that a servant can walk into any room in the palace whenever he has to take out the garbage. He just pops in. The servant goes into anywhere. The minister needs an official. He's dressed like a minister. He has the official. Everything has to be much more official. So the servant can walk right in. He walks right to Hashem, and he's able to ask Hashem anything he wants. That would be the simple understanding. Rabbi Yochanan says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, a person should not daven only in a house that has windows. Shenemar, as it says in the book of Daniel, in his attic, the windows were open to him towards Jerusalem. So you see, it's important to daven in a place where there's windows. We learned this Gemara once before. We discussed it. You're able to concentrate better. You look towards heaven. You feel humbled. There were other reasons. Amar Rav Kahana. Rav Kahana says, "Chatzif alai man de mitzali bebakso." It is chutzpah. Chatzif. It's like chutzpah for someone who davens in a valley that doesn't have any gate around it, because a person who davens like that is sort of like feels like a free. He's like free, and when you daven in a place that has walls, it's more humble. It's more humbling. That's at least one of the explanations.
We learned previously that you have to make a place for your prayers. And that's
True.
when we studied about the windows.
Yeah, but there it means you have to have a set place. Here we're talking about having walls around where you're davening, and
Right, not to be open.
that
to
should be open.
A set place, yeah.
It shouldn't be open. That's what the Gemara here is talking about. Now, it allows you to. Rashi over here says that when a person is in a makom tznius, a person is in more of a humble place, modest place, the fear of heaven is upon him and his heart is broken. That's Rashi's explanation. Another explanation is that there's less disturbances and people walking by, and additionally, it looks like he's arrogant that he doesn't believe that anything will disturb him. I can daven anywhere, nothing will disturb me. So it's a little arrogance as well. It is chutzpah to me, in my eyes, anyone that specifies their sins in public. Shenemar, as it says, Ashrei Nisui Pesha Kisui Chata. Praiseworthy is this, that his sins are forgiven because he covers them over and doesn't reveal them. And which means that he covers them over, he's embarrassed from his sins. And if a person reveals them, it seems like he's not embarrassed from his sins. And now we can recite this last line together. Hadron Allah ein oimdim. And that means may the chapter Ein Oimdim return to us. We shouldn't forget it. Hadron Allah Ein Oimdim, Hadron Allah Ein Oimdim. We say that may it return to us. We shouldn't forget it. We've Mazel Tov, everyone. We've concluded the fifth
Mazel
chapter
Tov.
exactly on time. Look at that, how it just worked out like that. The last day of the
Exactly, Max.
So Baruch Hashem, I want to thank all of you for joining me and learning this and enhancing my learning and of this and all of the great insights and additions that you've enhanced my learning with. And I hope to finish many more chapters with all of you. That's Hashem, God willing, with good health for all of you.